The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. 6:47 a.m. I found myself rage posting about immigration policy, my fingers flying across my phone screen with righteous fury. I was defending positions I couldn't actually explain, citing statistics I hadn't verified, feeling morally superior to people whose full perspectives I'd never encountered. The horror hit me mid-sentence. I had become addicted to the drug of certainty about issues I understood only superficially. That physiological rush of being right, the dopamine flood of moral superiority, felt exactly like wisdom. But it was actually preventing me from learning anything real about the complex issue I was so confidently explaining to strangers on the internet. Have you ever caught yourself defending a position you realized you couldn't actually explain? What if that feeling of being right is actually a drug that prevents learning? What I discovered is that millions of us are high on opinions we can't defend, addicted to certainty we haven't earned. We built a civilization that operates like a massive certainty casino, and most of us don't even realize we're gambling. This isn't about becoming wishy-washy or abandoning your values. It's about understanding why genuine wisdom requires recovering from our addiction to opinions, and what becomes possible when we do. Chapter 2. The Dopamine Dealers of Silicon Valley. Something fascinating happened during the 2024 election cycle that reveals everything about our modern addiction crisis. While election officials were still counting ballots, millions of people were already posting confident predictions, detailed analyses, and passionate defenses of outcomes that hadn't been determined yet. Social media platforms lit up with expert commentary from people who couldn't explain the electoral college system if their lives depended on it. Welcome to the Certainty Casino, where Silicon Valley has engineered the most sophisticated addiction delivery system in human history, and the drug of choice isn't cocaine or alcohol. It's opinions. Your smartphone isn't just a communication device. It's a portable psychological slot machine designed to keep you gambling with certainty about issues you don't actually understand. Every notification, every like, every algorithmic feed, Refresh operates on the same behavioral modification principles that keep people glued to Las Vegas casino floors for days at a time. The mechanics are devastatingly elegant. Social media platforms use what psychologists call variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the same technique that makes slot machines so addictive. You never know when your next opinion will hit the jackpot of viral validation, so you keep pulling the lever. The platform rewards your most extreme, most confident, most emotionally charged takes with engagement, training your brain to produce increasingly polarized content. Have you ever noticed how good it feels when someone likes your political post? That's not just social validation, that's a measured dopamine hit, carefully engineered by algorithms that have analyzed billions of user interactions to maximize addiction potential. Consider Twitter's engagement optimization. The algorithm doesn't reward thoughtful, nuanced analysis. It rewards content that generates strong reactions: outrage, tribal loyalty, moral superiority. A tweet saying, "This immigration issue is complex and I'm still learning about it," gets zero engagement. A tweet saying, "Anyone who disagrees with my immigration stance is either evil or stupid," gets hundreds of responses. The platform literally pays you in attention currency for performing certainty about topics you may have encountered for the first time that morning. Have you ever felt physically agitated when someone challenged your opinion online? That's withdrawal. Your brain has become accustomed to the chemical reward of certainty, and genuine questioning threatens to cut off the supply. TikTok has perfected this even further. Their For You page creates a psychological environment where users develop confident opinions about complex geopolitical situations based on 15-second videos created by 20-year-olds who learned about the topics from other 15-second videos. The platform's algorithm specifically amplifies content that generates immediate emotional reactions, creating a feedback loop where complexity and nuance get systematically filtered out. Why do you think your most controversial opinions get the most engagement? What might your need to educate strangers on the internet really be protecting you from? The business model is brutally simple. Engagement equals revenue. The platforms discovered that uncertainty doesn't generate clicks, but certainty, especially angry, tribal certainty, keeps users scrolling for hours. They've essentially created digital opium dens, where the drug is the illusion of knowledge, and the side effects include political polarization, relationship destruction, and the systematic erosion of democratic discourse. The 2024 election cycle revealed this addiction at scale. Platforms profited enormously from the certainty addiction epidemic, selling advertising against content that made Americans more confident and more wrong simultaneously. Foreign adversaries didn't need to create fake news, they just needed to amplify the certainty addiction that was already destroying our ability to think clearly about complex issues. We've created a world where you can develop passionate expertise about a geopolitical crisis based on a 15-second TikTok video, then confidently explain it to people who've studied the region for decades. The Dunning-Kruger effect has gone viral. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. The casino is designed to feel like education. Every algorithmic feed creates the illusion that you're becoming more informed when you're actually becoming more addicted to the neurochemical payoff of having strong opinions. The platforms show you content that confirms what you already believe, sprinkled with just enough opposing viewpoints to make you feel intellectually balanced while actually reinforcing your existing certainties.
Have you ever felt physically agitated when someone challenged your opinion online? That's withdrawal. Your brain has become accustomed to the chemical reward of certainty, and genuine questioning threatens to cut off the supply.
The casino psychology runs deeper than individual posts. Like Las Vegas casinos, social media platforms are designed with no natural stopping points. No clocks, no windows, infinite scroll. The refresh function operates exactly like a slot machine lever. You never know what dopamine hit might be waiting in the next batch of content. The platforms use sophisticated psychological manipulation to keep you gambling with opinions long past the point where you're learning anything useful. Echo chambers aren't accidental. They're carefully engineered environments where your certainty addiction can flourish without the uncomfortable interference of contradictory evidence. The algorithm learns your opinion patterns and creates a customized certainty delivery system, showing you content designed to make you feel smart, informed, and morally superior, while systematically filtering out information that might complicate your worldview. This isn't happening to other people. This is happening to us. The most educated, well-intentioned people are just as susceptible to certainty addiction as anyone else, perhaps more so, because we're convinced our sophistication makes us immune to manipulation. What if your social media feed is designed to make you stupider, not smarter? The result is a civilization where having strong opinions about everything has become the primary currency of intellectual status, while admitting uncertainty has become a mark of weakness. We've created a culture where "I don't know" feels shameful, and "I'm absolutely certain" feels empowering, regardless of how much we actually understand about the topic at hand. The question is, what happens to human wisdom when entire societies become addicted to the drug of certainty? And more importantly, what happens to people who decide to get clean? To understand that, we need to examine what one ancient philosopher discovered about the psychology of knowing and not knowing, insights that threatened his society so much they killed him for it. Chapter 3. When Socrates nearly destroyed democracy. In 399 BCE, the Athenian democracy sentenced a 70-year-old philosopher to death for asking too many questions. Socrates' crime wasn't theft, murder, or treason. His crime was making people uncomfortable about the certainty of their beliefs. The official charges were corrupting the youth and impiety. But the real threat was simpler. He was teaching people to examine their assumptions instead of defending them. The Athenians weren't being dramatic. Socrates genuinely was dangerous to their society. Not because he had the wrong answers, but because he refused to stop asking questions that revealed how little anyone actually knew about the things they claimed to understand completely. Here's what Socrates discovered that was so threatening. The human brain is fundamentally wired to prefer certainty over accuracy. When we encounter information that challenges our existing beliefs, our amygdala activates as if we're facing physical danger. Admitting we don't know something triggers the same neurological stress response as being chased by a predator. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Socrates intuited 25 centuries ago. Brain imaging studies show that when people's core beliefs are questioned, the regions associated with physical pain light up dramatically. Our certainty literally feels like safety, and uncertainty feels like mortal threat. This isn't a character flaw, it's how human consciousness evolved to navigate a dangerous world. But here's the psychological trap. The safer certainty feels, the more it prevents the kind of sustained inquiry that leads to genuine understanding. Your brain treats your opinions like vital organs that must be defended at all costs, even when those opinions are based on incomplete information or inherited assumptions you've never actually examined. When was the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something politically important? Not when you added new information that confirmed what you already believed, but when you fundamentally shifted your position based on evidence that made your previous certainty look naive. The Socratic method threatens this entire psychological system. Instead of providing answers that make people feel secure, Socratic questioning systematically reveals the shaky foundations beneath our most confident positions. What do you mean by justice? How do you know that's true? What evidence would change your mind? These questions don't attack specific beliefs. They attack the psychological comfort of believing itself. This is where the certainty casino metaphor becomes crucial. Socrates was essentially asking, "Are you sure this game isn't rigged?" He was the person pointing out that the house always wins when you stop questioning the rules. The casino's business model depends on keeping players convinced they understand the odds, when the real game is much more complex than anyone realizes. Genuine philosophical inquiry threatens the certainty casino because it reveals that most of what we think we know we actually believe. And most of what we believe we inherited from culture, family, media, and social pressure, rather than through systematic investigation. The casino profits from this confusion between knowledge and belief, between information and understanding. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable "I don't know" feels in professional meetings? The social pressure to have opinions about everything creates a psychological environment where intellectual humility becomes professionally dangerous, while intellectual arrogance gets rewarded with status and authority. Research in cognitive psychology reveals that people with higher uncertainty tolerance consistently outperform their more confident peers in problem-solving, creativity, and learning speed. They make better decisions under pressure, adapt more quickly to changing circumstances, and build more accurate mental models of complex systems. The people who are most comfortable saying, "I don't know," are typically the ones who end up knowing the most. But uncertainty tolerance is a learnable skill that most cultures systematically discourage. From childhood, we're taught that smart people have answers, not questions. Academic systems reward students who can confidently repeat information, not students who can identify the limitations of that information. Professional environments promote people who project certainty, not people who demonstrate intellectual curiosity. The psychological mechanisms run deeper than conscious thought. When you encounter information that contradicts your existing beliefs, your brain automatically activates what psychologists call motivated reasoning, the unconscious process of finding ways to dismiss threatening evidence while accepting confirming evidence. This isn't stupidity, it's a sophisticated psychological defense system protecting your sense of identity and belonging? What if your strongest convictions are actually your biggest intellectual liabilities? What if the positions you defend most passionately are the ones you've examined least thoroughly? Socrates understood that genuine learning requires temporary psychological discomfort. The famous Socratic ignorance. Knowing that you don't know isn't a comfortable state. It's actively unpleasant. Your brain interprets the uncertainty as danger and creates strong motivation to return to the safety of certainty as quickly as possible. This creates what modern psychologists call the certainty addiction cycle. Uncomfortable uncertainty leads to quick opinion formation, which provides temporary psychological relief, which makes future uncertainty even more threatening, which drives increasingly extreme position-taking to maintain the illusion of knowledge. The casino analogy captures this perfectly. Once you're addicted to the psychological payoff of certainty, walking away from the game feels impossible, even when you recognize that you're losing. The house has convinced you that not playing is more dangerous than continuing to play a rigged game. Why do you think admitting ignorance feels shameful rather than wise? What cultural programming taught us to equate uncertainty with weakness, instead of recognizing it as the starting point of all genuine learning? But here's where Socrates' insights become both hopeful and challenging. If certainty addiction is learned, it can be unlearned. If our psychological need for opinions is conditioned, different conditioning becomes possible. The question isn't whether we can recover from certainty addiction. It's whether we're willing to tolerate the temporary discomfort of not knowing in order to develop the capacity for genuine understanding. The Athenians killed Socrates because they weren't willing to experience that discomfort. They preferred the familiar certainty of their existing beliefs to the uncertain possibility of wisdom. The question for us is, are we brave enough to walk away from the certainty casino, knowing that the outside world might be more complex and challenging than the simple stories we've been telling ourselves? What would happen if you spent a week systematically questioning your core beliefs instead of defending them? What if the anxiety of not knowing is actually the beginning of wisdom, rather than a problem to be solved? Understanding why this feels so threatening and why it's so necessary requires examining what certainty addiction actually looks like in daily life, and how to begin developing the psychological tools for recovery. Chapter 4. Withdrawal Symptoms and Recovery Protocols. Learning to walk away from the certainty casino requires developing sophisticated self-awareness about when you're gambling versus when you're genuinely exploring. Like any addiction recovery, this process involves recognizing specific triggers, managing withdrawal symptoms, and developing new behavioral patterns that serve your actual learning rather than your psychological comfort. The first breakthrough comes with real-time addiction recognition. Your body actually provides early warning signals before your mind fully engages opinion addiction mode. Physical tension building in your shoulders, a slight acceleration in your heart rate, that immediate urge to search for confirming evidence. These are your diagnostic indicators that the certainty craving has activated. Here's what that looks like in practice. I call it the Opinion Pause Protocol, a specific 3-step intervention you can use the moment you feel yourself getting pulled into the casino. Step 1, the somatic check. Notice what's happening in your body. Are your jaw muscles tightening? Is your breathing becoming shallow? These physical signals often show up before the psychological compulsion to form immediate opinions about complex information. Step 2, uncertainty acknowledgement. This is where you explicitly state, out loud if necessary, I don't have enough information to form a reliable opinion about this. This isn't self-deprecation, it's intellectual honesty that interrupts the addiction cycle before it fully activates. Step 3, curiosity redirection. Replace the question, what do I think about this, with, what would I need to understand this more completely? This simple shift moves your brain from judgment mode into genuine inquiry mode. Have you ever caught yourself Google searching to prove you're right rather than to learn? This is one of the most common relapse patterns in certainty addiction recovery. The search engine becomes your drug dealer, providing hits of confirming evidence rather than comprehensive understanding. Modern intellectual courage looks different than most people imagine. It's spending 3 hours researching which coffee maker to buy, then admitting you need more information before forming confident opinions about complex constitutional law during your lunch break. Now, advanced uncertainty tolerance training requires progressive exposure to not knowing in increasingly challenging situations. Start small. Spend 1 day avoiding expressing opinions about trending news stories. Just don't. Notice the psychological discomfort that comes up. Notice the compulsion to have immediate reactions. Notice the social pressure to participate in certainty-based conversations.
This discomfort? It's normal. It's temporary.
And it's the beginning of building genuine intellectual muscle. Let me introduce you to something I call the Steel Manning technique. This provides sophisticated practice for engaging opposing viewpoints without triggering your defense mechanisms. Instead of looking for flaws in positions you disagree with, you practice presenting those positions more compellingly than their own advocates could. Here's how this works in practice. If you disagree with a political position, Steel Manning means researching that position until you can argue for it so effectively that actual supporters would say, "Yes, that's exactly what I believe and why I believe it." This practice systematically disrupts the certainty addiction cycle by forcing your brain to genuinely comprehend complexity rather than dismiss it. What if your urge to correct people is actually an addiction craving? Think about it. The compulsion to educate strangers on the internet, to set the record straight, to ensure people understand the obvious truth. These behaviors often mask psychological needs for certainty validation, rather than genuine concern for others' understanding. Relationship navigation becomes crucial here because opinion addiction recovery can feel threatening to people who are still gambling in the certainty casino. When you start saying, "I don't know," more frequently, some people interpret this as intellectual weakness rather than sophisticated honesty. I've developed what I call the curious engagement framework, specific language patterns for maintaining relationships while practicing uncertainty tolerance. Instead of saying, "That's wrong because," try, "I'm curious about your perspective on this aspect." Instead of, "Everyone knows that," try, "My understanding is limited, but I've encountered information suggesting." Instead of, "You should realize that," try, "What's your experience been with?" These aren't manipulation techniques. They're authentic expressions of intellectual humility that often generate more productive conversations than certainty-based discourse. Why do you think changing your mind feels like losing rather than winning? This psychological distortion reveals how deeply certainty addiction has colonized our sense of intellectual identity. In reality, changing your mind based on better evidence is one of the highest forms of intelligence, but our culture has trained us to experience it as personal defeat. Understanding withdrawal symptoms becomes essential because uncertainty tolerance creates temporary but intense psychological discomfort. Common withdrawal symptoms include anxiety when encountering complex information without forming immediate opinions, compulsive fact-checking to restore certainty rather than to deepen understanding, irritation when others express confident positions you can't immediately refute. You might experience social awkwardness in opinion-based conversations, fear that intellectual humility will be perceived as ignorance or weakness. These symptoms are normal, they're temporary. Like physical addiction withdrawal, the discomfort decreases as your brain adapts to new patterns of engaging with information and uncertainty. Measuring progress in certainty addiction recovery involves tracking specific behavioral changes. Increased frequency of saying, "I don't know," without shame. Decreased compulsion to have immediate reactions to trending news. Improved listening quality in disagreements, reduced anxiety when others hold opposing views. You'll notice accelerated learning in areas of genuine interest. Enhanced creativity and problem-solving capacity. These are the real rewards of recovery. Have you noticed how much energy you spend defending positions versus exploring them? Recovery redirects that defensive energy toward genuine curiosity. This typically results in dramatically accelerated learning and more satisfying intellectual relationships. Relapse prevention requires recognizing that certainty addiction recovery is an ongoing practice, not a permanent achievement. High-stress situations, social pressure, and identity threats can trigger reversion to old patterns. The goal isn't perfection. It's increasing awareness and faster recovery when you catch yourself gambling in the certainty casino again. Advanced practitioners develop what I call intellectual humility confidence, the paradoxical strength that comes from being secure enough in your intelligence to admit the boundaries of your knowledge. This isn't relativism or wishy-washy thinking. It's sophisticated recognition that genuine understanding often requires sustained uncertainty tolerance that most people find too uncomfortable to maintain. What might become possible if you were more interested in understanding than being right? This question points toward the transformative potential of uncertainty tolerance, not just for individual learning, but for the relationships, institutions, and societies that we're part of. But before we explore those broader implications, we need to understand what happens when entire cultures become addicted to certainty, and how individual recovery connects to collective healing. Chapter 5. When entire civilizations overdose. Your recovery from certainty addiction doesn't happen in isolation. Every relationship, every workplace interaction, every family dinner becomes a test case for whether individual psychological change can survive in systems designed to reward opinion-based thinking. What you discover is that personal transformation inevitably becomes social transformation, whether you intend it or not. The most immediate shift happens in your closest relationships. When you start practicing intellectual humility, some people experience relief. Finally, conversations can move beyond performative certainty toward genuine exploration. But others feel threatened. Your willingness to say, "I don't know," can make people uncomfortable about their own need to have opinions about everything. Your curiosity about opposing viewpoints might be interpreted as disloyalty to shared tribal positions. Family systems particularly resist change. Thanksgiving dinner conversations that used to operate on mutual certainty reinforcement suddenly become awkward when one person starts asking genuine questions instead of trading confirmed biases. What makes you confident about that isn't a confrontational question, but it can feel threatening to people whose sense of connection depends on shared certainties rather than shared curiosity. Have you noticed how moderate has become a dirty word in contemporary politics? This reveals something crucial about how certainty addiction operates at institutional levels. Democratic governance theoretically requires the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to change positions based on new evidence, and to compromise with people who hold different values. But certainty-addicted systems treat these democratic virtues as character flaws. Workplace dynamics become particularly complex because professional environments typically reward confidence over accuracy. The person who confidently presents incomplete analysis often gets promoted over the person who accurately identifies the limitations of available information. Institutional incentives systematically select for certainty addiction, while filtering out intellectual humility. This creates what organizational psychologists call false confidence cascades. Situations where everyone pretends to be more certain than they actually are, because admitting uncertainty feels professionally dangerous. The result is institutional decision-making based on performed certainty rather than genuine understanding, leading to predictably poor outcomes that everyone could have anticipated if intellectual honesty had been psychologically safe. When you practice uncertainty tolerance in these environments, you're not just changing your own psychology, you're implicitly challenging the entire system's addiction-based operational model. This can create positive change, but it can also create social isolation if you're the only person willing to admit the emperor's naked intellectual state. The political implications extend far beyond individual relationships. Democratic societies theoretically depend on citizens' capacity to engage complexity, change minds based on evidence, and maintain relationships across ideological differences. But certainty-addicted populations become vulnerable to manipulation by leaders who promise simple answers to complex problems. Why do you think expertise alternately gets worshipped and completely rejected in modern discourse? Both responses serve the same psychological function: avoiding the personal responsibility for thinking through complex issues by delegating certainty to authority figures or dismissing expertise entirely when it threatens preferred conclusions. Mass psychology research reveals that certainty addiction spreads through social networks like a contagious disease. Communities develop collective opinions that become more extreme over time through a process psychologists call group polarization. The social pressure to demonstrate tribal loyalty through increasingly confident position-taking creates feedback loops where moderation becomes socially risky and intellectual humility becomes a mark of weakness or betrayal. Foreign adversaries have learned to exploit this vulnerability by amplifying existing certainty addictions rather than creating new false information. They don't need to convince Americans of particular positions. They just need to increase confidence levels in existing divisions, making compromise and democratic deliberation psychologically impossible. Here's where the certainty casino metaphor reaches completion. Entire societies become gambling establishments where complexity and nuance are banned because they threaten the addiction that keeps the system profitable for those harvesting attention and political power. Citizens become professional gamblers, and the house always wins by keeping everyone convinced that not playing is more dangerous than continuing to play a rigged game. What if our democracy is failing because we've forgotten how to be uncertain together? The capacity for collective intelligence requires individual citizens who can tolerate not knowing, change minds when presented with better evidence, and maintain relationships with people who hold different values. When populations become addicted to certainty, democratic institutions cannot function because they require psychological capabilities the population no longer possesses. Individual recovery from certainty addiction becomes a form of civic responsibility. Every person who develops genuine uncertainty tolerance contributes to the cultural capacity for democratic discourse, scientific thinking, and adaptive problem-solving. Your personal psychological work isn't selfish. It's essential infrastructure for a society capable of navigating complex challenges without retreating into tribal certainty. This doesn't mean abandoning values or becoming relativistic about important moral questions. It means distinguishing between core principles worth defending and tactical opinions that should remain open to revision based on evidence and experience. It means developing the psychological strength to hold strong values while remaining intellectually humble about implementation strategies and empirical questions. But recovering from certainty addiction in a certainty-addicted culture creates a particular challenge. How do you maintain intellectual humility without becoming self-righteous about intellectual humility? How do you practice uncertainty tolerance without developing certainty addiction about the superiority of uncertainty tolerance? The answer requires understanding some deeply counterintuitive principles about how wisdom actually works. Insights that challenge popular assumptions about confidence, expertise, and intellectual growth in ways that most people find disturbing rather than encouraging. Chapter 6. Why uncertainty makes you dangerous. Here's what the self-help industry won't tell you about intellectual humility. It's not a weakness that makes you more likable. It's a cognitive weapon that makes you more powerful than people addicted to certainty. While everyone else is gambling in the certainty casino, you're learning to see the cards. The counterintuitive truth is that uncertainty tolerance doesn't make you wishy-washy. It makes you strategically unpredictable. When you're not locked into defending predetermined positions, you can adapt faster, learn quicker, and navigate complex situations with a flexibility that certainty-addicted people simply cannot match. Consider leadership research that consistently shows a disturbing pattern. The most confident people in decision-making roles are often the least competent, while the most competent people typically express more uncertainty about their conclusions. This isn't modesty, it's superior pattern recognition. People who actually understand complex systems know how many variables they cannot control or predict. Have you ever noticed how the most compelling people admit confusion more freely than others? This isn't coincidence. Psychological research reveals that people trust leaders who acknowledge the limits of their knowledge more than leaders who project absolute certainty. Authentic uncertainty signals intellectual sophistication, while performed certainty often signals insecurity disguised as confidence. The paradox cuts deeper. Your willingness to say, "I don't know," makes people more likely to trust what you do claim to know. When you demonstrate intellectual honesty about your limitations, your areas of genuine confidence carry more weight because people know you're not just performing expertise to manage their impressions. This creates what organizational psychologists call earned authority, influence based on demonstrated judgment rather than claimed expertise. People who practice intellectual humility typically build stronger professional relationships, make better decisions under pressure, and inspire more loyalty than people who lead through projected certainty. But here's where it gets genuinely dangerous. Uncertainty tolerance makes you immune to most forms of manipulation. Political leaders, marketing campaigns, and ideological movements depend on exploiting people's certainty addiction. They offer simple answers to complex problems, tribal identity in exchange for intellectual independence, and emotional certainty in place of actual understanding. When you develop genuine comfort with not knowing, these manipulation strategies stop working. You can't be recruited into movements that require you to stop asking questions. You can't be sold products that promise to eliminate uncertainty from inherently uncertain aspects of life. You become psychologically inaccessible to anyone whose power depends on other people's intellectual insecurity. Why do you think certainty often signals insecurity rather than actual knowledge? Because genuine expertise involves intimate familiarity with how much remains unknown in any field. The person who claims to have simple answers to complex questions is usually the person who understands those questions least thoroughly. There's something deeply amusing about how confident people become about complex topics they've spent the least time actually studying. It's like watching someone become a chess expert after learning how the pieces move. The strategic advantages extend to creative and professional problem solving. Research consistently shows that people with higher uncertainty tolerance generate more innovative solutions, adapt more effectively to changing circumstances, and make more accurate long-term predictions than their more confident counterparts. This isn't because uncertainty tolerance makes you smarter. It's because it frees your intelligence from the defensive work of protecting predetermined conclusions. Advanced practitioners learn to weaponize intellectual humility in negotiations and conflicts. When you can genuinely consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, you can identify solutions that other people miss because they're psychologically committed to proving their initial positions correct rather than finding optimal outcomes. What if your strongest opinions are actually your biggest blind spots? This points to perhaps the most counterintuitive insight. The positions you defend most passionately are often the positions you've examined least rigorously. Strong emotional investment in particular conclusions tends to prevent the kind of systematic investigation that leads to reliable understanding. Expert-level uncertainty tolerance involves learning to hold contradictory perspectives simultaneously without rushing to resolve the tension through premature conclusion forming. Most people find this psychological state unbearable, but it's precisely this discomfort tolerance that enables breakthrough insights that escape more certainty-driven thinkers. The social dynamics become particularly interesting. People recovering from certainty addiction often discover that their relationships improve dramatically, not because they become agreeable, but because they become genuinely curious about other people's perspectives, rather than strategically listening for ways to advance their own positions. This creates a paradox that challenges popular assumptions about strength and vulnerability. Intellectual humility makes you more influential, not less. Strategic uncertainty makes you more persuasive, not less. Admitting what you don't know makes people more likely to trust what you do know, not less. But the ultimate counterintuitive insight involves the relationship between confidence and competence. True expertise typically involves what psychologists call confident humility, strong confidence in your ability to learn and adapt, combined with realistic humility about the current limits of your knowledge. This psychological stance enables continuous growth while avoiding the stagnation that comes from protecting existing certainties. Have you observed how people trust you more when you admit what you don't know? This reveals something most people never recognize. Authentic uncertainty often communicates more strength than performed certainty, because it requires genuine security in your intelligence to admit intellectual limitations publicly. The danger of uncertainty tolerance isn't that it makes you weak. It's that it makes you immune to the psychological manipulation strategies that entire industries depend on. In a world designed to profit from certainty addiction, people who are comfortable not knowing become genuinely threatening to systems that require intellectual compliance for their continued operation. Understanding why this feels so counterintuitive and why practicing it remains so challenging even after you understand the theory requires honest examination of what uncertainty tolerance actually costs and what realistic expectations look like for people attempting this psychological transformation in a certainty-addicted culture. Chapter 7. Learning to live without the fix. It's been 18 months since that 6:47 a.m. moment when I caught myself rage posting about immigration policy. And I'd be lying if I said recovery from certainty addiction has been straightforward. Last week, I found myself mid-argument with someone online about artificial intelligence safety, feeling that familiar rush of moral superiority, before recognizing the old patterns and stepping back. The addiction doesn't disappear. It just becomes more visible. Here's what practicing intellectual humility doesn't solve. It doesn't eliminate the fundamental human need for meaning, belonging, and psychological security. It doesn't make complex political decisions easier or family relationships less complicated. It doesn't protect you from making mistakes or guarantee that your increased uncertainty tolerance will lead to better outcomes in every situation. What it does provide is a more sustainable relationship with the inherent uncertainty of being human. Instead of constantly fighting against not knowing, you develop the psychological tools to navigate ambiguity without retreating into false certainty or paralyzing relativism. The ongoing challenges are real and worth acknowledging. Social pressure to have opinions about everything doesn't decrease just because you've recognized opinion addiction as a problem. Professional environments still reward confident presentation over intellectual honesty. Family gatherings still involve people who interpret "I don't know" as intellectual weakness rather than psychological strength. Recovery involves accepting that you'll regularly disappoint people who expect you to take strong positions on issues you don't understand well enough to judge confidently. You'll lose some social connections with people whose relationships were built on shared certainties rather than genuine curiosity about each other as individuals. What would your relationships look like if you prioritized understanding over being right? This question points toward both the promise and the challenge of intellectual humility. Some relationships deepen dramatically when they shift from mutual certainty reinforcement toward authentic exploration. Others don't survive the transition because they were based on tribal identity rather than genuine connection. The psychological complexity runs deeper than most personal development frameworks acknowledge. Humans appear to be neurologically wired for tribal certainty as a survival mechanism. Complete uncertainty tolerance might actually be psychologically unhealthy. We need some stable beliefs and values to function effectively in the world. The goal isn't to eliminate all certainty, but to become more discriminating about what deserves confident belief versus what deserves continued questioning. This requires ongoing calibration that doesn't have simple rules or guaranteed outcomes.
Advanced practice involves what you might call
meta-intellectual humility, uncertainty about uncertainty tolerance itself. How do you know when intellectual humility is appropriate versus when decisive action based on incomplete information serves better outcomes? How do you distinguish between productive uncertainty that opens learning possibilities versus destructive uncertainty that prevents necessary choices? These questions don't have neat answers, which is both frustrating and liberating. The certainty casino promised simple solutions to complex psychological needs. Recovery means accepting that some aspects of human experience will always involve navigating ambiguity without clear guidance. How might your learning accelerate if you weren't protecting previous conclusions? This question captures something essential about the long-term benefits of uncertainty tolerance. When you stop using intellectual energy to defend existing positions, that energy becomes available for genuine exploration and adaptive learning. The practical development pathway involves several ongoing practices rather than a single transformation event. Daily opinion fasting. Periods of consuming complex information without forming immediate judgments. Regular position auditing. Systematically examining your most confident beliefs for unstated assumptions and emotional investments. Curiosity cultivation. Practicing genuine interest in perspectives that initially trigger defensive reactions. But perhaps most importantly, developing intellectual humility about intellectual humility itself. This isn't a superior way of thinking that makes you better than people still gambling in the certainty casino. It's one psychological approach among many, with its own limitations, blind spots, and potential for becoming another form of identity-based superiority. The transformation isn't dramatic or immediately visible to others. You don't suddenly become wise or start making perfect decisions. What changes is your relationship to learning, your capacity for genuine curiosity about opposing viewpoints, and your ability to maintain relationships across ideological differences. Recovery from certainty addiction is like physical fitness, an ongoing practice rather than a destination. You develop stronger psychological tools for navigating uncertainty, but you still need to use those tools actively in challenging situations. The addiction patterns remain accessible during stress, conflict, or identity threats. What becomes possible when you're no longer afraid of not knowing? In my experience, the answer is more learning, better relationships, increased creativity, and a kind of intellectual freedom that comes from not having to defend predetermined positions against contradictory evidence. But the deepest change might be simpler: the relief of no longer pretending to understand things you don't actually comprehend. The psychological space that opens when you stop performing expertise you don't possess. The energy that becomes available when you're not constantly managing other people's impressions of your intelligence. This isn't about becoming a better person or achieving some advanced state of consciousness. It's about becoming more authentic to the actual limitations and possibilities of human understanding. In a world addicted to the drug of certainty, that authenticity becomes both a personal practice and a quiet form of cultural resistance. The question isn't whether you should recover from opinion addiction. It's whether you're ready to live with the uncertainty that recovery requires.